In this class, we are exploring the evolution of economic systems, how they've changed over time, what different countries have had now and over time. So we need to start off with understanding what an economic system even means. We're bringing in the idea that we're not just focused on the market, we're not just focused on the economy. An economic system is going to incorporate multiple dimensions. And with that in mind, what we're basically saying is we want to do a holistic approach. There is a certain interdependency where, yes, the way the economy is functioning is obviously important since we're trying to understand economics in this class, but we have to understand how the economics of a country is embedded in its politics, how it's embedded in its culture, and how each one of these different areas affects each other. So what we're describing is a holistic approach. So you may have seen an image like this before, and there's various kinds around, but if you spend some time looking at it, if it hasn't already jumped out at you, in one way of looking at this, you are seeing a young woman who's looking over her right shoulder, and you're just getting the very profile view of her. But if you look at it another way, you see an old woman. I always love stuff like this, and I never get to use it in economics, so I couldn't pass up the chance. And all I'm trying to point out here is that that's kind of like what it is to examine a country and try to understand how it has evolved to this level today, why it's the way it is, and usually it helps us understand why something working in one country can't just be lifted up and put down into another country. So to arrive at a definition of an economic system, we can see from the book that it is a framework of institutions and the framework of economic, political, social, cultural institutions. And it is this entire framework that is answering the questions that every economy has to answer. What are you going to produce? How much are you going to produce? What are you going to charge? Who's going to get it? You may have been told in an intro econ class that these questions can be answered by a capitalist market system. It can be answered by a command and control system. So that's what we're basically talking about when we are talking about an economic system. This is a quote from the Clark book itself, that an economic system cannot be described or understood if you don't look into the nature and historical evolution of its broad institutional matrix. So one word that keeps popping up is institution. So to get a definition of an institution, we need to realize that it is a very broad term. It's not just, I don't know, a building that you might be thinking of, like that's an institution. And it's not just a government with a written constitution. It's actually just a very broad term for how people are going to govern their interactions. So it's some sort of cluster of rules, which could be formal, like it's actually written down, this is how you will act if you're a member of this organization, but it can also be informal, like how you act in a society. If you've done any international travel, you may have found yourself perhaps accidentally offending people because you didn't understand the informal cluster of rules of how things were done in that society. And so institutions serve the valuable role of helping people act in a way that is productive and inoffensive and can achieve their goals. Here is a diagram from a different textbook that I thought might help us understand the importance of institutions. So what we see here overall in this diagram is they're trying to say that GDP per capita, which is a measure of your output per person, that it is essentially caused by these various parts of the diagram. And so the closest to the GDP per capita is the factors of production. So countries that have high GDP per capita have organized their factors of production to produce a lot and therefore have a lot per person. All right, well, that's obvious enough. Why do some countries organize their factors of production and some do not? Well, you're only going to make an investment in a business if you can make a profit out of it. So you have to have the incentive of profit maximization to do that. All right, well, why do some countries have an incentive to do that and others don't? Well, that is going to take you to the institutions, the informal and formal set of rules. Are there things like property rights that if I make this investment, it will be mine if it actually does pay off. That is an institution that would create an incentive to organize their factors of production and therefore have higher GDP per capita. So hopefully that gives you some understanding of what we mean when we're talking about institutions, both formal and informal, that they're actually governing the behavior of the people in the economy. So then we see from that diagram the importance of incentives and institutions. That's what organizes the factors of production. So of course, a country with low physical capital will be less productive because there is less to work with. But the question then is, just giving them physical capital, would that change their output? And the answer is, it depends on the institutions of the country. The institutions set the rules of the game, and if the institutions are not there to create the incentives to organize the factors of production, adding extra capital will not actually lead to higher output. So as we have said, institutions include both the formal written institutions like laws and regulations, but also the informal institutions like the customs and practices of a culture, how it acts, its social mores. The institutions that promote growth are those that align self-interest with the social interest, so that you have the incentive to maximize profit. That is in your self-interest, but if the institutions are leading to economic growth, that is in the social interest. And what we see with wealthy countries is they do have the types of institutions, formal and informal, that do incentivize people to use the factors of production in a way that is going to lead to maximizing profits for themselves, self-interest, as well as higher GDP per capita, which is the economic growth we need for the social interest. And so the types of institutions that we tend to see aligned with economic growth does include property rights, which I mentioned before, having an honest government, which means a government that is not corrupted by selfish interests, political stability. Obviously, a country going to civil war is not going to be conducive to growth. A legal system is very important. You've got to be able to protect your property, you've got to be able to make contracts, you've got to be able to enforce contracts, and then a competitive and open market where you will be able to buy and sell the goods. Often when we try and help a country that is not growing, if we do just try to give them physical capital, like we said before, if you don't have the incentives from the institutions to use the factors productively, a lot of times it just does not work in producing the higher output we would like. So all of that was to explain the importance of institutions in helping us align the self-interest with the social interest. But there are cases where that just does not work well within the market, and that would be the collective action problems. So that is essentially when the individual, following their own self-interest, is going to make choices that are detrimental to the overall group that they are in. And some of the examples that were mentioned in the book include prisoner's dilemma, which you might be familiar with from your intro micro class with oligopoly. But a prisoner's dilemma is a particular interdependent game where the best outcome won't be selected by the players involved, because following their own self-interest, they're going to choose an outcome that is not ideal. And without some sort of intervention, that's going to be the outcome. Externalities are not present in all productive activities, but there are products that will produce a negative product along with the intended one. So the obvious one would be pollution, air pollution, water pollution. Again, without any sort of outside institution to check this, you will end up with more pollution than is ideal. And then there is also tragedy of the commons as an example of a collective action problem. So with the tragedy of the commons, this is a specific example of the self-interest not aligning with the social interest. Generally, it comes from a lack of property rights. If you think about a public restroom versus a private restroom, people approach the use and the responsibility they feel to the protection of a communal asset very different from one that they themselves own. And while that is the root of the problem, a lot of times we cannot fix such a thing by assigning property rights to, say, the ocean. So we do have to come up with other institutions to deal with this conflict between the self-interest and the public interest. So we can do hunting and fishing licenses, for example. If it was a smaller society, they might develop an economic system where it is just people having the social mores that you don't abuse a common resource, that sort of thing. So there are various ways to deal with it, but this is the third and final example of a collective action problem that does require some sort of institution to be developed to deal with the issue. All right, so we develop an institution, totally fixes the collective action problem. Everything is great, right? Sometimes, but unfortunately the existence of an institution does create a possibility to the behavior called opportunism, which is being willing to defect from whatever the institution is requiring, whether it's a formal institution and you're actually breaking laws, or if you're just sort of breaking the informal rules. There can be a benefit to this misbehavior as long as everybody else is following the rules. And as it says here, philosophers have long recognized the danger to society posed by the opportunistic pursuit of narrow self-interest. And so one modern example could be the vaccination issue that is so popular in the news today. There are anti-vaxxers who are choosing not to vaccinate their children because they see some sort of cost to the potential health of their children. And so they're prioritizing that cost over any benefit that would come to all of society by vaccinating. But if too many people defect, then you start to lose any benefit of the vaccination. And so that is an example of how opportunism can undermine the institution trying to solve the collective action problem. So Clark gives us quotes from 3 different philosophers that are each appealing to a different realm for a check on this opportunistic behavior. Kant is appealing to morality. If we would all act in a way that would be okay, if everybody acted that way, then it would be okay. We would not let self-interest trump the social interest. With David Hume, he's appealing to a legal authority, a government, to set laws that would stop us from letting self-interest trump private interest or social interest. And finally, we have Adam Smith appealing to the power of market competition to check our behavior. That is the idea of the invisible hand, where the invisible hand leads us in a way that following our self-interest does in fact promote the social interest. So seeing those 3 philosophers is introducing the idea of the 3 realms that Clark wants to use throughout the book. And so he notes that academia was, of course, trying to, solve these big problems. And so one of the ways to do that was to get more specialty in your investigation. And so they start dividing all of human affairs into these more specific areas. And so one is the economy. And obviously that is studied by economists who are looking at market exchanges. Then you have the polity, which is what political scientists study, and they're looking at the governing process, so the economy and the state essentially. And then the third one he mentions is civil society. And that's going to be studied by sociologists, anthropologists, social psychologists, and they are looking at non-economy, non-polity issues where humans are interacting. So one of the points Clark is making is having that separation into these different areas and totally different academic fields did lead to a lot of advancements in our knowledge and our understanding. But he's arguing that today we really need an interdisciplinary approach, that there is something that is lost with all of these areas of human interaction being split apart. And so we probably need to start with understanding what is governing each one of those three dimensions he's introducing. So for each one of the realms, what we want to remember for now and throughout the book is the market coordinates the economy. The market is the governance of the economy. The state is coordinating the polity, and the communities coordinate the civil society. So you have the three realms: economy, polity, society, and then you have what governs each of those three realms: the market, the state, and the communities, respectively. When you keep the three realms separate, it can be difficult to explain all the human behavior that we actually observe. In the economy, one of the things we do assume is that people are behaving by following their self-interest. Communities, however, are thinking that people are following more the golden rule, more of a reciprocity rule. And when we try and look at only one of these to explain all behaviors, we do struggle with what we actually observe. And so we are left with two different models of human behavior. We use Homo economicus, economic man, when we are in the economic realm, and we use Homo reciprocans perhaps to understand the community or the state, the behavior there, where people are acting more on the golden rule. And we have this quote here from John Stuart Mill, which is critical of our Homo economicus, and yet he didn't say we shouldn't use this model of human behavior, because it did essentially work when we were using it within the context of the economy. But yes, it does cause, it is one of the main criticisms of economics that we have a human actor that does not really capture all the ways that people behave. So here is an example. In economics, in more recent years, we have done some actual experiments to see, are people behaving the way we are assuming with Homo economicus. So there is something called an ultimatum game, where the researchers pair two individuals and they give one of the two a $10 bill. And that person is then instructed to offer some amount of the money to the partner. And the understanding is if the partner says no, they get nothing. Both of them get nothing. So you don't want to offer such a low amount that you end up with nothing, right? But you're not going to offer them $10 because, well, then you don't have anything. So what is the lowest offer you would accept? So think about that. You're sitting across this guy. He was handed $10. He's going to make an offer to you, and then if you accept it, you keep those amounts as he offered it, and otherwise nobody gets anything. All right, so once you have that number in your mind, what you would be willing to accept as your lowest offer, now let's think about it in context of Homo economicus and Homo reciprocans. Homo economicus would accept anything greater than 0. 1 penny would be rational to accept because you didn't have a penny before. But Homo reciprocans would say, well, now wait a minute. I'm getting a penny and you're getting $9.99. I don't think so. That is not fair. And so that does seem to indicate, and that is what they found. People weren't willing to accept ridiculously low offers. They wanted to punish them, the other person, for offering too low amount, even if that meant everybody got 0. So there is truth that we do seem to have a sense of fairness, a sense of reciprocity in our actual behavior. So anyway, to sum up, we have different models for how people act depending which realm we're looking at. We're not saying any of them are wrong or bad. We're just acknowledging there may be limitations as we go deeper in a particular realm. Okay, we can wrap this chapter up pretty quickly now. Where we're going to go with the future chapters is the different types of economic systems nations have. So of course, one question you might have is, why do different nations have different systems? And here's some names of the systems that we will be exploring: capitalism, fascism, socialism, communism, even feudalism and mercantilism, and all the way back to a community-driven primitive tribe. So in the future chapters, we'll be looking into each one of those. And of course, the short answer to why different nations have different systems is it's a variety of factors that determine what kind of economic system a nation has today. You can look back at the chapter for a little more detail on each one of these, but certainly the geography, is this country easily accessing waterways or not? Landlocked is a very different situation. The history, have they been taken over by other countries a lot? Have they been maybe able to be self-governing for a long time? You see various institutions listed there, the economic, political, cultural institutions. So all of these are going to have some impact on not only what the economic system is today, but what it has been over time. And particularly once we get to the later chapters where we're looking at a chapter on each country, as will be done in the group projects, one of the things that is interesting is identifying the economic systems and identifying how they change over time. And so what, how, why do economic systems change or evolve? Efficiency is certainly part of it. Changing the way economic activity is happening because of other technological changes that may have occurred has changed how efficient we can be in production. That can be an impact, and that was a really weird, vague way of saying the Industrial Revolution was a big shock that did change how economic systems were going to function going forward. We could perhaps be on the cusp of another transition if artificial intelligence, for example, does have a big efficiency impact on production in the future. And another reason why you might have an economic system change from one to the other could just be issues around the power. Who is being empowered by the change? Who is losing power? Obviously, that can be something that might stop a transition for a while. With the Industrial Revolution as our example, we saw a change to efficiency and to power as something called factory owners started to exist. But change is not something that humans are comfortable with. So institutions tend to endure as long as they serve a useful purpose. And as challenges are arising to the current system and there's the seeds of the new system, at first the reaction will be simply to reform and keep things as they are. The textbook suggests that we have seen turning points in these various time periods, but it takes a lot to actually get to an institutional change. Two of the constraints he specifically mentions are path dependence and institutional coherence. So path dependence is the possibilities of what you can transform to are shaped by what has happened in the past. So if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of modern Russia, they can't shake off all historical experiences from some of their communist institutions. And so that past has actually shaped what possibilities they could move to in the future. And then there is always going to be institutional coherence. It's why you can't just pick up, okay, these rules, this system, this works really well in this country, let's slap it down on this country. It's got to be coherent within their various realms, right? So what is their historical experience with the state, with the community, and possibly even the economy? And so these are definitely constraints on the evolution of economic systems. All right, so that is a wonderful introduction to our first chapter, and we will be going a little deeper into the three realms in chapter 2 when we start assessing the economic systems.